Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This message is for January 12th, 2025. It's a snowy day, um, and you can listen to it anytime that you want. And we are starting the 10 plagues that were brought against Egypt so that Pharaoh would let God's people go. And so there are 10 plagues. There's the plague on the Nile, the Nile was turned to blood. There were the frogs. There were the lice or gnats. I think it's King James says lice. NASB and NIV say gnats. Technically, it could be translated flies, which is probably more accurate, in my opinion. But the following one is gnats or flies, so they want to differentiate between them. And so that's how we do it. And these first four plagues are really kind of categorized as nuisance plagues. And they're nuisances. They're not, nothing dies, nobody dies, no animals die, big animals. And, the Nile was turned to blood, but they could dig in the bank of the Nile and get some filtered water that didn't have blood in it. The rivers, even the bowls of water and stuff like this had turned to blood. So it was a nuisance. And this was a problem that was for Israel as well. Then there were the frogs. Frogs were everywhere. They were in the ovens, and they were in the houses, and they were in the kneading bowls, and in the beds, and around the furniture, and underfoot, and in the houses all over the place. It was a nuisance. Frogs can't hurt anybody, though. They don't bite. Then you have the gnats, and the gnats just got on everything. I've had experience with mosquitoes just being everywhere, and you're just constantly whacking them away, and you try to have very little of your flesh showing, and you're spraying yourself and trying to make them go away. How these people live up in Africa, in Alaska during the summer, and out in the bush where there's just constant flies and everything. Even in northern Michigan, they have plagues of gnats and flies that'll bite you. And then there's the flies. The flies are very persistent. You can have one fly in your house and it just bothers you and buzzes around your head and just is constantly making their noises. And the flies are a nuisance as well. So these first four are nuisance plagues. And then the following six are economic and personal plagues. It really hits them in the pocketbook. It kills their livelihood. That damages their crops. And people die. And you get physical boils and all kinds of issues physically. And then the last one is the angel of death. So there we have it. Those are the 10. And I want to point out that the Nile is basically a river that starts up in very, very high snow-capped volcanic mountains, and it makes its way all the way down through the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean. And it's a very long river, a very mighty river, has several branches, and this river basically makes a ribbon of greenery through a desert region which is called Egypt. And so it is life-giving. If it weren't for that river, nobody could live there, or very few people anyway. And they have gods in Egypt, and they have big gods. Big gods. They don't have little gods. They got big gods, and they'll build monuments to them and temples to them. Even Pharaoh is considered a god. And one by one, God brings down this pantheon of gods. Now, perhaps you've never quite heard it stated that way, but in Numbers chapter 33, and I'm looking at verse 4, it says 33 and verse 4, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn. They were doing that because of the last plague, the angel of death coming over. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, the Lord had also executed judgment on their gods. So, Moses and the gods of Egypt. And I have a book that has that very title, Moses and the Gods of Egypt, written by John Davis, one of the seminary professors I had in the 1970s. And he wrote this book, and a lot of the information that I have that you won't find in the Bible, but undergirds and helps you understand the information of the Bible, I get from that book. So if you wonder, well, where did he get that from? I've just told you. And I don't read hieroglyphics, and I don't read Egyptian, but there are people who did, and they went in and they to these sacred temples that were buried with tons and tons of sand, and they dug them out, and they saw these hieroglyphics up there, and they began to decipher them and know who the gods were and how they depicted them and stuff. And so a lot of the information is gathered together, and it's not made up. I just want you to know that. So the first situation is that the Nile is turned to blood. And the Nile is a very, very important thing to Egypt and is one of their most exemplary gods or important gods to them. And sometimes they called it Num or Khnum. And according to Egyptian myth, the great deep of water gave forth life, and from it came Re or Ra, the sun god, and sun god became greater than the river of deep water. And if you remember the creation story that's in the Bible, God created heavens and earth, and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the deep. And then later on, the sun was made. Light had occurred in the first day, but then the sun and the moon were made, and the stars also later on. And so there is the concept of deep water, and the concept later on of the sun being made by God. But the Egyptians, they have some of this information, but it's been twisted, and they have deep water, and then it gives rise to the sun, and the sun becomes the great God. Now, Satan would like you to think that things that are created can become greater than what was created, the Creator, so that the great water, the great deep, gave rise to Ra, the sun, and the sun became the supreme God. And that's the kind of thing you get when there's a retelling and a stepping away, retelling of the creation story, and a stepping away from belief in God, and they worship the created things rather than the Creator, and they get all confused. And then somewhere along the line, some smarty person, not complimentary, thinks, oh, look, there are other creation stories, and they could be right. Well, no, they couldn't. Um, the greater gods do not come from lesser gods. Now, Satan would like you to think that because he is a created being, and he wants you to think that he can become greater than God. That's his quest. All of the eons that he's been in existence, he wants to become like the great God, and he wants to make a replacement of him. I want you to notice also that in the story of the Nile turning to blood, it turns to blood, and when man was created, he was created from dust, and when he dies, he returns to dust. And but the creation story, so to speak, of Egypt says we go back to water, and that's not correct either. And so life is not in the water. According to God, life is in the blood, and God makes a distinction. You don't drink the blood. You don't eat with the blood not being drained from an animal. Life is in the blood. And then the very last plague, which is the plague of the angel of death going over Egypt, unless people kill a lamb and put the blood over the lintel doorposts of the house, unless the angel sees that blood, the firstborn will die in that household. And so you have to be covered by the blood. And so the first plague has blood, the last plague has blood. Here's another thing, and that is that in all of the religion, the various gods and whatnot that are involved in Egypt, there's no animal sacrifice. There's no shedding of blood. And so we have this situation where the Israelites wanted to go sacrifice unto their God, and Pharaoh says, well, why don't you just go a little bit of a journey and sacrifice it here in the land? And then Moses brings up an objection and says, the sacrifices that we will make will be considered odious. Not only will there be sacrifice of an animal, and it'll be the blood, but it'll be most likely sheep, and sheep are considered an abomination to the Egyptians. And so Moses said we have to go out of the land lest we become odious, and a lot of people don't realize that. But getting to the Nile, it says in verse 8, now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle, then he does the snake thing, you see. And then after that, the water is turned to blood a day or so, or some days later, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. This is a quality that Pharaoh has. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. You shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the water, and that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, Say to Aaron, Take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, over their pools, and over all their reservoirs of water, that they may become blood, and there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in the vessels of wood and the vessels of stone. This is something that affected Israel too. God wanted Israel to know about these and firsthand see what was happening to the Egyptians as well. So Moses and Aaron did even as the Lord had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. Now, people that don't want to believe in the miracles of the Bible, they say, well, it was just red earth that was brought down as silt. When I lived in Ohio, and for the first time I went down to Florida and Georgia, and one of the things that I noticed was that the earth was red down there. It wasn't what I call dirt color, more of a black or sandy brown, but it was red. Then when I go over to Africa, the dirt over there is red as well. And the Nile runs through Africa, and most of the African area has kind of a reddish dirt. And so when there is flooding, it takes away some of that topsoil red dirt, and the river turns kind of a reddish tint to it and washes it down, and that goes out onto the overflow into the banks and replenishes the ground with topsoil, and they get a boost in their crops plus the irrigation of the water. And so those that don't want to believe in miracles say, well, this wasn't really a miracle, it was just incredible timing, and so all of these water things just had red dirt in it. No, it was blood. I mean, come on, give me a break here. The Israelites and the Egyptians, they know blood when they see it. And I can tell you, just like that, the difference between water and blood. And I've cut myself enough in shaving, and I've seen blood, and I've been in the hospitals, and people are getting blood. I know blood when I see it, and they know blood too. And so these people that try to play little tricks with the Word of God and reinterpret it and explain away the miracles and say these people didn't know what was going on, it just doesn't hold water. So this was turned to blood, and there was a great fish kill. Now that doesn't mean that there haven't been fish kills before. Every time there's a change in the water, the temperature, the oxygenation or something, you get a fish kill once in a while. But this was a great fish kill. And so this happened, and they were having trouble getting water, and if they went down to the Nile and they got back a bit and dug into the sand, and they could get water that they could drink, but with difficulty. And so he calls his magicians, and they do some trickery and make it appear as if they could do this thing too. Now I don't know how they do that, but I've watched magicians and the things that they do and stuff on TV, and I'm astounded at what they can do, and it's all trickery and sleight of hand. But Satan is powerful too, and God allows Satan certain leeway in doing some astounding things. Nevertheless, they were able to duplicate, and that's all Pharaoh needed, and he ignored that. 7 days passed, after the Lord had struck the Nile and it had reverted back to clearer water. So Pharaoh showed no concern, but God's purpose was to hit the pride of the Egyptians and to show that the Nile god Khnum and also Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, weren't all that. Okay. Then there was the spirit of the Nile, Hapi, and I had mentioned about that. And he was the Lord of the fish and the birds, and the Lord of the marshes and the rivers. And so Hapi, not just the Nile, but the rivers and the tributaries and the little side bars and the pools and the marshes were all affected. And this is typically in the hieroglyphics depicted as a woman with breasts, distended belly, showing that she is with child, loincloth of a man, and a ceremonial beard. So there's kind of confusion of this. And these fish, they all died, the marshes, everything, they had this blood. And even the bowls of wood had blood in them as well. So it wasn't the red silt, it was blood. Well, now in chapter 8, the second nuisance plague, then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and on your people and into your ovens and into your kneading bowls. So the frogs will come up on you and your people and all your servants." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, the streams, over the pools, and make frogs come up out of the land of Egypt." So that's what Aaron did. But the magicians did the same thing with secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Entreat the Lord that he will remove the frogs." Now, entreat the Lord. Now he feels like there's something to the God of Israel, and you entreat him, and you get these frogs out of here. Now, let me tell you something. That's moved Pharaoh a little bit. He's willing to acknowledge that there is a God of Israel, and this is quite the nuisance. You know, the missus, she has these frogs in her bed. She has these frogs in her oven. She has these frogs in her kneading bowls. They're underfoot. They're in her house. I'm telling you that if there's a mouse in a house, if there's cockroaches, ants, women don't like it. And here are frogs all over. Now, the funny thing about this, their god, the frog god, was a symbol of the protector of the home and fertility. And a lot of these women would wear little amulets around their neck with a frog on it, and that would be a protection to their pregnancy. And so this god, Hecht, in the form of a frog, and Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, because that's where the frogs were coming from, and they were everywhere, and it wasn't this a hoot. The god that was the protector of the home And the god that was the fertility god was going crazy. And it wasn't a protector of the home, it was an invasive thing everywhere, underfoot. People didn't care for it. I like frogs. I like toads, but I don't like them in my house. And, you know, they're just were everywhere. And so Moses, pardon me, came to Pharaoh, and Moses said to Pharaoh, I'll get rid of these. The honor is yours to say when you want them gone. And he said, tomorrow, tomorrow, I want them gone. So, when shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people that the frogs be destroyed from you and your houses, and they may be left only in the Nile? Tomorrow. So, tomorrow they were gone. They were out of the house. They had to maybe shovel up the dead ones and throw them out onto heaps. And so here they were out on heaps. And he said here in verse 8, the Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, and they may sacrifice to the Lord. Whoa, hey, how about that? Problem solved. Oh no. After the frogs were tamed down and they weren't a nuisance anymore, Pharaoh hardened his heart and he decided not to let it happen. So the Lord did, verse 13, according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, the courts, and the fields. So they piled them up in heaps, and the land became foul. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Well, so God causes another plague, and this time this plague is not announced. There's no warning. It's another nuisance plague, and these are gnats. Now, King James has lice. That's bad too. But gnats or some type of stinging insect. Down in Florida, they have what are called no-see-ums. And you can have a screen on your window and to get air in, and it'll keep out most things, but the little no-see-ums can get right in there and they'll sting you. But there were gnats of some sort or another, some nuisance thing, and so they caused these gnats on, says verse 17, they did so, and Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. Just a constant tormenting around here. People that have horses, a lot of times in the summertime, they'll put something over the entire horse's head to protect the flies from getting in their mouth and into their eyes and into their ears and all kinds of stuff. They protect them, and they're a constant nuisance. And these horses will stand with the tail to the head of one and the tail of the other one to the other's head, and they'll swish those tails and they'll bat the flies away from their rear end and their partner's face. But it's constant nuisance, and so these can be nuisances. And it says here, all the dust of the earth became gnats through all the land of Egypt. Israel wasn't exempted again. The magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. That was one they didn't know how to do. So there were gnats on mans and beasts, and they said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. This is not something we can do. And you better start paying attention. But Pharaoh, he hardened, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. So he wasn't going to relent to this, and he disregarded his own priests. He wasn't listening to anybody now. He was a very stubborn man. And this was kind of like a punishment for reneging on saying that the people could go out. And then the final nuisance was the flies. And the flies, they actually worshipped a fly god. It was called Uatchip, a god who manifested himself as a fly. The fly was worshipped for its resilience and staying at things and being a pest and diligence. And but there were no flies in the land where Israel dwelt, so that Egypt and also Pharaoh would know that God was in the land and that he could make a demarcation between Israel and Pharaoh and the people. And so he was there. This wasn't just a happenstance, because there had been flies before, there had been gnats before, there had been fish kills before, there had been frogs before, and it might have been easy for somebody to talk themselves into this is all happenstance. But no, no. The flies, God protected the Israelites from the flies. Nope, not going to have it. And so he manifested those flies all over the place except in the land of Israel. Let me see if I can find this to you. Verse 20. Now the Lord said to Moses, Rise early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water, and say to him, Thus says the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you, and on your servants, and on your people, and into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they dwell. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people are living, so that no swarms of flies will be there, in order that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. I'm here. And I, the Lord, I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign will occur. Then the Lord did so, and there came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh. You just got to laugh, you know. And of his servants, and the land was laid waste because of the swarms of flies in all the land of Egypt. Oh, now what was Pharaoh's statement now? Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, called for them, and said, Go sacrifice to your God within the land. But Moses said, It is not right to do so, for we will sacrifice to the Lord our God what is an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, I explained that to you a little bit earlier. They were going to sacrifice sheep, and sheep are an abomination, and the Egyptians didn't do blood sacrifices. If we sacrifice what is an abomination to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We must go a 3-day journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he commands us. Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you shall not go very far away. Make supplication for me. Then Moses said, Behold, I am going out from you, and I shall make supplication to the Lord, that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only do not let Pharaoh deal deceitfully again, in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So Moses went out from Pharaoh, made supplication to the Lord. The Lord did as Moses asked, and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servant, from his people. Not one remained, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go. So here you have a very stubborn man. And there are things that happen in his life. And when they're happening, he says, Oh Lord, he becomes reasonable, and he acknowledges the existence of God, and pray for me, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And then when there's relief, he goes back on his word, acts like God doesn't exist, doesn't plan to worship God or to acknowledge his existence. You know anybody like that? You know anybody who has trouble and now all of a sudden they start praying and they want to be religious and ask God to help them, and then when they get relief from that, God isn't in their mind anymore. They won't come to church. They're not going to pray. They're going to live their secular, unreligious life like God is no player at all. Well, my friends, I guess they just don't have enough trouble. And God has 1,001 ways to make people think a little bit more sincerely about Him. And men have hundreds of ways of avoiding and confronting that there is a God in heaven, and He should be important to them. Let's not be so stubborn. Man is very, very stubborn. The hardest thing on this earth is not steel or diamonds, titanium, but it's the human heart. And you must yield your heart to the Lord by choosing to worship Him.